The day would come when all his hard work would pay off, when he would be ready to show the world what he was capable of. Until then, he kept his head down, working relentlessly, silently honing his skills. Every challenge, every day that seemed like a struggle, was simply part of his preparation for the moment when he would finally reveal his true strength. And when that time came, no one would be able to deny it. The challenge in front of him seemed impossible. The stakes were higher than ever, and it was clear that this was a moment where failure would have consequences. Everyone around him was bracing for him to crumble, certain that he couldn't possibly handle what was about to come. The others, confident in their own abilities, saw him as nothing more than a weak link, someone who would fall under pressure. His rank, his past failures, everything about him screamed that he wouldn't stand a chance. Yet, despite the overwhelming situation, there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't ready to give up. What they didn't know was that he had been silently preparing for moments like this. Behind the scenes, in the quiet of his own space, he had been training relentlessly, honing a skill that no one had seen yet. It wasn't flashy or loud. He didn't need to announce his progress to anyone. Instead, he focused on becoming stronger, step by step, always in the background, always working toward this one moment. Though it seemed like he was unprepared, the audience could sense there was more to him than met the eye. They could feel the build-up, the quiet anticipation that he was on the verge of showing his hidden skill. As the challenge unfolded, the protagonist stumbled a bit at first. His body ached, his mind raced with doubts, and his energy waned. But there was something about the way he fought back, something different, something purposeful. He wasn't just reacting, he was thinking, calculating, waiting for the right moment. It was clear that this wasn't the first time he had faced adversity. He had trained for this, though no one knew it yet. Each move he made, every struggle he faced, felt like part of a bigger plan. The tension in the air was palpable as the audience waited for the inevitable reveal, the moment when they would finally understand what he was truly capable of. As the challenge progressed, something changed in the protagonist's movements. It wasn't obvious at first, but those watching began to notice. There was a shift in his stance, a slight change in the way he responded to pressure. His reactions became sharper, his steps more calculated. The way he handled the situation, though still struggling, hinted at something more. The protagonist wasn't just another weak person trying to survive. There was an underlying strength that was starting to show. The others, who had been mocking him only moments before, started to exchange looks. They couldn't put their finger on it, but they all sensed it. He wasn't as helpless as they thought. His movements were becoming more controlled, his confidence slowly growing. It was clear that this was no longer the same person they had written off. The audience watching could feel the tension building. They had seen enough to know that something was happening, but they still weren't sure what. The protagonist wasn't revealing everything at once. Instead, he was teasing the edges of his hidden skill, just enough to make them doubt their initial judgment. While some of the crowd continued to underestimate him, others were beginning to whisper. The protagonist was still holding back, still waiting for the right moment to fully unleash his potential. But what little they saw was enough to make them question their assumptions. The skill that had been hidden for so long was starting to show in flashes. Nothing too flashy, nothing too obvious, but just enough to spark curiosity. The stage was set, and the audience knew that the true display of power was still coming. But for now, they were left with a glimpse. Just a small hint of what was to come. As the protagonist continued on his journey, the change in him became harder to ignore. His progress was no longer as subtle, but it wasn't enough to convince everyone. People around him began to notice that he was no longer the same weak individual they had once dismissed. His movements were sharper, his decisions more confident, and the small victories he had won were starting to add up. Yet they still couldn't put the pieces together. No one knew exactly what had changed or what had made him better. They saw improvements, but they still underestimated him. They thought it was just luck or some temporary boost. Doubts began to form. Some of his peers who had once laughed at his weaknesses now exchanged looks of confusion. Had they been wrong about him all along? They could sense his growth, but without understanding the full scope of his hidden abilities, they were unsure whether it was just a fluke or the result of something more. They couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye, but they were still hesitant to acknowledge it fully. They still saw him as the lowest rank, the one who wasn't supposed to amount to anything. The protagonist's silence. Through all of this, the protagonist said nothing. He didn't boast about his improvements or flaunt his abilities. Instead, he continued to hold back, keeping his true potential hidden. The more they doubted him, the more he stayed silent. The protagonist knew that revealing everything now would be too soon. He wasn't ready to show his full strength just yet. The doubts and underestimation from others only fueled his quiet determination. He understood that the less they knew, the more dramatic his eventual rise would be. As the protagonist's improvements became clearer, the tension around him grew. Those who had once mocked him now began to question their earlier judgments. The ones who had written him off as weak were now starting to wonder if they had misjudged him entirely. But despite the growing suspicion, the protagonist kept his abilities under wraps, biding his time and waiting for the right moment to show them what he was truly capable of. The challenges the protagonist faces continue to grow larger and more difficult. Each step forward seems to bring him closer to a breaking point, and the obstacles he faces now are far more dangerous. However, through each battle and test, he remains calm, composed, and focused. It's clear that something deeper is at play, though no one around him, not even the audience, knows the full extent of his potential. Every challenge he faces pushes him further, but he doesn't seem to crack under the pressure. If anything, he gets stronger, more precise, and more determined with every test. There are subtle moments that show the audience glimpses of the protagonist's true power, but he keeps it under control, not letting it fully come to the surface yet. His movements become sharper, his decisions more calculated. It's almost as if he's holding something back, a secret he's not ready to reveal. Those around him begin to feel that he's no longer the weak, low-ranking individual they once knew. They sense something in him that's changing, something that doesn't quite match his rank or appearance, but they can't quite put their finger on it. The audience, too, feels the tension rising as the protagonist edges closer to the moment when his full skill will finally emerge. As the stakes increase and the protagonist continues to push through seemingly impossible challenges, the tension becomes palpable. Those who have been watching him, especially his peers, begin to question how he's managing to handle the increasing difficulty of his tasks. They start to whisper among themselves, wondering if there's something more to him than they had realized. Still, the protagonist remains quiet, his focus unwavering. Every struggle he faces feels like it's inching him closer to the moment when everything will change, when his true potential will finally be revealed. For now, the protagonist's hidden skill remains a mystery. It's there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed.